The hospital doors swung open with a loud creak as a woman burst in, carrying a little girl in her arms. Her face was pale with fear, and her hands trembled as she clutched the child's frail body. The girl's eyes fluttered weakly, her breathing shallow, her skin burning with fever. Desperation filled the woman's voice as she pleaded, "Please, someone help her." The reception area was eerily quiet for a moment. Nurses exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Finally, a doctor, dressed in a crisp white coat, stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the woman, then at the child in her arms. "Do you have insurance?" he asked, his tone firm but detached. The woman's lips quivered. She hesitated. I don't," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But please, she's just a child. She needs help." The doctor let out a small sigh, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't treat patients without proper documentation or payment. Hospital policy." His voice was calm, almost indifferent, as if he had done this 100 times before. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. "But she'll die. Please, I'll pay later, I promise. Just save her first." The doctor glanced at his watch, then back at her. "If you can't pay, there's nothing I can do." And with that, he turned away, walking down the hall as if the child's life meant nothing. The woman's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, holding the girl close. Her heart pounded in her chest as panic set in. She looked around, hoping, praying that someone, anyone, would step forward, but the nurses avoided her gaze. Patients waiting in the lobby sat still, some whispering among themselves. No one moved. And then, from the far end of the hallway, a different kind of sound echoed. A hurried set of footsteps, light but urgent. A woman in a faded uniform, carrying a mop and a bucket, came rushing forward. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a nurse. Just the cleaning lady. Her eyes widened as she saw the child, barely conscious in the woman's arms. Without hesitation, she dropped the mop, knelt beside them, and reached out. "Let me see her," she said gently. The woman hesitated for a second, then nodded frantically. The cleaning lady touched the girl's forehead, feeling the intense heat radiating from her skin. "She has a high fever," she murmured. "She needs help now." The doctor had refused. The hospital had turned them away. But this woman, someone who wasn't trained to save lives, someone who spent her days scrubbing floors, was the only one willing to act. And what she did next left everyone in the hospital in shock. The cleaning lady's hands moved fast, far more urgently than anyone expected. She placed the back of her hand on the child's forehead again, confirming what she already knew. The fever was dangerously high. The little girl's body was weak, her lips dry and cracked. She needed immediate care. The mother looked at her, eyes pleading. "Please do something. She can't breathe properly." The cleaning lady, Maria, didn't hesitate. She had worked in the hospital for years, quietly scrubbing floors, emptying trash bins, and wiping down counters. But in all those years, she had watched and learned, observing nurses take temperatures, listening to doctors discuss symptoms, watching patients come and go, some leaving healthy, others never walking out again. She knew she wasn't a doctor. She didn't have a degree, but she had something else. A heart that couldn't ignore suffering. Without another word, Maria lifted the child carefully into her arms. She wasn't strong, but adrenaline gave her the strength she needed. The mother, surprised yet desperate, followed closely as Maria walked swiftly past the waiting area, past the nurses who stood frozen in place, past the doctor who had just dismissed them without a second thought. The doctor glanced up as they passed, frowning. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Maria didn't stop. She didn't have time to argue. She pushed open a door marked "Employees Only" and entered a small supply room. Inside, shelves were lined with medical supplies, basic first, aid kits, fever reducers, antiseptics, clean towels. She set the girl down carefully on a small bench and grabbed a damp cloth, pressing it against her burning forehead. The child let out a weak whimper. The mother, still in shock, stammered, What are you doing?" "I may not be a doctor," Maria said quickly, "but I know a fever this high can cause seizures. We need to bring it down before it's too late." She reached for a bottle of water she had in her cleaning cart and helped the little girl take small sips. The child was barely able to swallow, her tiny body trembling. Outside the room, voices were rising. The doctor was speaking to a security guard. "Find that woman. She has no right to take a patient without authorization." Maria knew she didn't have long before someone stopped her. The mother's hands clutched at her own chest, fear evident on her face. "She's getting worse," she whispered. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady her own nerves. Then she made a decision, one that could cost her everything. "We have to get her to the emergency ward," she said firmly. "With or without their permission." The mother's eyes widened. "But they won't let us." Maria looked at her, determination burning in her eyes. "Then we won't ask." She lifted the child again, wrapping a towel around her small body. The mother quickly moved to help, holding her daughter's hand tightly. Outside the room, the doctor and security guard were already searching. The tension in the hospital was thick. Nurses whispered amongst themselves. Some were uneasy, shifting, uncomfortably, as they realized that a woman who had spent years mopping their floors was now doing more to save a life than any of them had. Maria's heart pounded as she stepped out of the room, the mother by her side. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. Then, the doctor spotted them. His face twisted in frustration. "Stop right there!" he barked. Maria didn't stop. She took a deep breath and did something she never imagined she would. She ran. The mother ran beside her, tears streaming down her face as she held onto her daughter's limp hand. They raced down the hallway, past the waiting area, past stunned patients and nurses who didn't dare intervene. Security moved to block them, but then something unexpected happened. One of the nurses, a young woman who had been watching silently, suddenly stepped forward. "She's right," the nurse said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That girl needs help." The doctor turned sharply. "This isn't your call." But another nurse stood up. Then another. "She's just a child," one of them said. "We took an oath to help people, not turn them away." Another added. The tension shifted. The doctor's authority, which had seemed absolute moments ago, was now being questioned. Maria didn't wait to see how it played out. She reached the emergency room doors and pushed through, her heart racing. And then finally, a real doctor, a different one, someone who had just come on shift, saw them. His eyes landed on the child, and immediately his face changed. "What happened?" he asked, already moving toward them. "She's burning up," Maria gasped. "She needs help now." Without hesitation, this new doctor called for a stretcher, for fluids, for medicine. Nurses rushed forward, no longer hesitant. The little girl was lifted from Maria's arms, placed gently on a bed, and wheeled away. Maria and the mother stood there, breathless, as the emergency team took over. For the first time in what felt like forever, the mother let out a sob, not of fear, but of relief. Maria felt her legs go weak. She had no medical degree, no title, no authority, But in that moment, none of that had mattered. And then, as she turned, she saw the first doctor, the one who had refused to help, watching from the hallway. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. His confident, dismissive expression was gone, because deep down, he knew he had turned away a life that could have been lost, and someone who was never meant to be the hero had stepped up instead. Maria stood there, her breath still uneven, her heart still pounding. The hospital that had been silent minutes ago was now buzzing with movement. Doctors and nurses rushed around, tending to the little girl, hooking her up to IVs, checking her vitals. The mother stood near the entrance of the emergency ward, her hands clasped together, whispering silent prayers. The first doctor, the one who had refused to help, remained frozen near the hallway. His fingers twitched slightly. As he adjusted his coat, his jaw clenched tight. He watched as the other doctor, the one who hadn't hesitated, took control of the situation with urgency. A strange look flickered in his eyes. It wasn't just disbelief, it was something deeper. Guilt. Maria, still standing near the doorway, could feel the weight of what had just happened. Her legs trembled, exhaustion settling in. But she kept her focus on the girl. She had done everything she could. Now it was in the hands of the professionals. Minutes passed like hours. Then finally, the new doctor stepped out from behind the curtain, pulling down his mask. His expression was calm, reassuring. He walked up to the mother and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's stable now," he said. "The fever was dangerously high, but we managed to bring it down. She was severely dehydrated, and if she hadn't gotten help in time..." His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. The mother covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she sobbed. Maria let out a shaky breath. Relief washed over her like a wave. The doctor turned, his gaze toward Maria, a knowing look in his eyes. "You saved her life," he said. Maria shook her head. "I didn't do much," she murmured. I couldn't stand there and do nothing." The mother turned to Maria then, stepping forward and grabbing her hands. "You were the only one who helped," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If it weren't for you..." She couldn't even finish the sentence. Instead, she pulled Maria into a tight hug. Maria stiffened for a second, not used to this kind of gratitude. But then she relaxed, patting the woman's back gently. Behind them, the first doctor still stood in silence. His shoulders were tense, his lips pressed together in a tight line. He had been in this hospital for years, making decisions based on policies and protocols. But tonight, he had been wrong, and deep down, he knew it. Maria finally turned to leave, ready to return to the job she had always done, the job no one ever noticed. But as she stepped away, a voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back to see the first doctor watching her. There was no arrogance in his tone this time, no dismissal, just something softer, a kind of respect. He hesitated, as if the words were foreign to him. "I should have helped her." Maria met his gaze, letting his words settle between them. Then she simply nodded. "Yes," she said, "you should have." For the first time in years, the doctor had nothing to say. Maria didn't need praise. She didn't need recognition. She just needed to know that a little girl would go home healthy, because she had chosen to act when no one else would. That was enough. As she walked back to her cleaning cart, she felt lighter. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a nurse. But tonight, she had made a difference. And sometimes, that was all that mattered.